So the idea is I want y'all to talk about how to think about your digital transformation, how to build out this ecosystem. So we're going to go a little deeper than what we did in the panel, starting on topics like, I want y'all to talk about like, how do you share data? How do you promote sales in these things? What are the things that you've actually learned in doing this? So I would love for y'all maybe to start with, oh, it's the same people. I was like, we lost Jason. But I would love for y'all maybe to start on the issue. We'll go back to the challenges that we were talking about. Irene, you mentioned auditability. Pilgrim, you talked about stopgaps, ripcords, or how to get out, extricate yourself from these things. Ginger, you talked about use cases. So what are some other challenges that maybe y'all want to bring up here that you think are useful?
One potential one, this may be more relevant for larger organizations, would be competing priorities. So if you're building out the ecosystem, not everyone may have the same idea of what's valued versus not. And so getting or persuading the right people to be involved at the right times can be a challenge occasionally.
Hey, can you guys hear me now?
Oh, we can. And yeah, this is,
sorry.
The other thing is y'all should just feel free to jump in. So Jen, Jason, Irene, Pilgrim, Ginger, just jump on in and talk. Y'all want to talk to each other. I'm not going to moderate this heavily.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was having some issues, but yeah, go ahead.
I think another challenge is a sort of tragedy of the commons kind of thing. So in IT, because you often have to do a lot of heavy lifting to make anything work, there's a lot of stuff that has to work before anything works. The first application to use, a new framework or a new platform, a new integration or whatever, has to do all the work. And that can make its business case really challenging. Once it's done it, the others can ride on the back. I mean, just think of, as soon as you've got Alexa in the home, suddenly everything else can be voice enabled at almost no cost. And you see that again and again. So I think in terms of apportioning costs and benefits, particularly in a big company, if you're arguing about budgets and so on, it's a bit unfair if the first thing has all the costs associated with it, because actually it's being the pipe cleaner that then makes all the other things really quick and cheap later.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think, the domain knowledge, question that came up a little bit earlier, because it's ultimately about domain knowledge, super important. I think that a lot of the conversation early on, which was really good, was very focused on sort of the initial opportunity around a singular connected product, but the real opportunity is about interconnected ecosystems over time. And I totally agree, Pilgrim, your notion of MVP ecosystem, it makes total sense, but even in the home, the money is not in selling smart home products to consumers. That's how do you enable retailers, healthcare providers, insurance providers, utilities cross over into the home. And to do that, you cannot have individual companies like Amazon be in the middle. So disaggregating trust and not getting into all that, I think, is super important. So I think we should talk about some of that. This is advanced class. Obviously, start small, but the real potential is interconnected ecosystems.
The start small aspect is really important, because a lot of the time these partnerships are created when there's been this kind of really grand art of the possible type of painted. And then when the first actual teams come in and try and implement this first kind of product, a lot of the time they're kind of trying to match this grand vision. And so then, oh, but we need this component to do this, and we need this component to do this. And you spend so much time building out the kind of full version of individual components before you even hook them up to each other and make sure that you have something that's running end to end. And so I think that a lot of the time, really that MVP style approach and say, okay, even if this isn't doing what we imagine it's going to do eventually, if we can just get the inputs and outputs, even toy versions of the inputs and outputs, and get the entire system running end to end, then you start to see the gaps. You start to see, oh, we need an expert of this type. We need to make these people in the same room. And then you can layer on complexity as you go, I think, all of the time.
I think that's totally right.
So Jen,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jason.
Well, I was just going to say that totally right. But the challenge that people get into. So yes, big vision. It's important. I always say shoot for the stars to land on the moon. But at the same time, when people set off a big vision, it's often in the mindset that they're going to own everything. It's going to be awesome. I'm going to own everything under the sun. And that's why you end up failing, because you can't own everything. You know, if you set off to start small, but be part of a growing, you know, network effect across an ecosystem of people that do good things, then it's doable. Sorry, Irene, go ahead.
No, Jason, I really wanted to riff off of what Jen was saying, though, because, you know, and I've been at Intel 5 years, and I had many years in industry and as a professor and a consultant. So I won't just be speaking from my Intel days, but you know, you get some of these relationships that start with a handshake between CEOs, and we used to joke about that and called it the chairman's baby. Because then you have this huge spotlight on something with really unrealistic expectations. And those unrealistic expectations need to be translated by people further down the organization. And those people tend to look like skeptics and people who are difficult to work with. And so sometimes the kiss of death, in my experience, has been that top level handshake. Ginger, you said it worked really well between Honeywell and SAP, but I've seen it work disastrously in other situations too. So I think there's a double-edged sword there as to how you manage it.
And the unrealistic expectation, not the exception, they're be the rule, I think. And so then how can we enable the actual on-the-ground technical teams to deliver in this kind of realistic fashion, that there is this perhaps unrealistic grand vision that they're trying to build towards.
And Ginger, you had something?
Well, I was just going to add, I think the technical side is one piece of it. We just implemented in March kind of what exactly is a partner program? What are all the stage gates you need to meet along the way? So it's not just a handshake, go do it. It's, okay, let's have the handshake. What criteria do we need to make sure is vetted? How do we have the right agreement and players in place? You know, what does onboarding look like in both sides, et cetera, with all these different functions involved along the way. So I really think it's important to see it as very interconnected. And then the only other thing I would add again or echo would be, when you work well with a company, it makes everything so much easier. And so luckily in the case of SAP, we just happen to have similar styles, and it helps the technical side or the business side go that much smoother.
Okay, and we have Thomas Jackson. Do you want to introduce yourself, Thomas? And
yeah, hi. My name's Tom Jackson. I work for a company called MicroShare. We're in the IoT business, serving a portion of the commercial real estate market, providing a variety of solutions there. But actually, recently we've been extending that into the industrial and factory space, but not in a traditional way. And that's actually where I wanted to pick up a little bit on this notion of partnerships. Some of the themes that have been discussed earlier are going to come forward, I think, in some of what I'm going to mention. But within the last 2 months, we've introduced a contact tracing app. And that contact tracing app was an extension of a prior product that we had called asset zoning, which we used in hospitals and whatnot to be able to locate physical devices in hospitals, like hospital beds and wheelchairs and the like. But we partnered with actually an investor and the LoRa Alliance ecosystem to develop this contact tracing solution. But and we've gotten quite a bit of press about that and have moved that into the market. And we're now deploying solutions in Malaysia, Singapore, and in parts of the UK and hopefully, and several installations now in the US. What I wanted to talk about, though, that's background. What I wanted to talk about was being able to engage partners in delivering that solution. And part of the challenge, the nice thing about that contact tracing solution is, we were talking about data sharing before. we aggregate data from bracelets and from location sensors that identify COVID, or excuse me, events that are 6 minutes in duration, 6 feet apart, and 10 minutes in duration. We aggregate that data, and then that data gets combined with a customer's data that we never touch. But we need a partner to be able to deliver the application on the customer's end that matches up employee data with a bracelet data. And so being able to have a dialogue with partners, and these are largely systems integrator partners, but other ones as well, have a dialogue with them that allows them to see that there's a real opportunity for them to deliver value there for a factory or for a global pharmaceutical company or for a national rental company, and allow them to get on board quickly, develop an application quickly, and deliver value quickly. That is what's been happening, but it is a challenge for it to happen quickly, and having customers and partners who can respond quickly to that. That goes back a little bit to this conversation earlier about big companies being able to move quickly and take advantage of things. So I know I talked about a lot there, but this recent history with contact tracing has been a real eye-opener for us. We need to be able to demonstrate to our prospective partners what the value proposition is for them, and also have global companies accept that this isn't a full solution that we deliver. We deliver the data that enables them to deliver contact tracing to their employees to create a safe and a workable work environment.
So do you think COVID-19 has been that kind of helped drive some acceptance there? And I'm curious if you guys are seeing any like things related to, that as a forcing function, I guess.
For us, it absolutely has been. And in some cases, doing something like contact tracing, there's not really an ROI involved there. That's about employee safety, about community safety, and about trust. And so that's for millions of employees and thousands or tens of thousands of companies that are trying to bring those employees back to work, having a mechanism that allows them to solve a problem quickly, isolate that problem, clean that space, identify employees who may have been, that's all an issue.
Okay.
So I think, Tom, part of what you're talking about really highlights some of what we were talking about in the session just before this, and that is who gains value, how do you harvest the value, and how do you package a solution in such a way, and once again, I'll speak in the industrial space, a industrial HR person may say, I need a contact tracking solution, or I need to be able to understand who's social distancing in my factory. But unless you bring them an integrated solution that has either camera data or some kind of wearables data and GPS coordinates and visual kinds of things, they're going to look and say, well, you're not really solving my problem. You're just bringing me a little piece of it. And so it becomes really incumbent upon you, unfortunately, in my opinion at least, to bring together those partners that you need to deliver that complete solution. Because most of the companies you're going to want to adopt this don't have either the deep understanding of what it's going to take, or don't have the technical chops to actually deploy it. So you're really talking about bringing solutions into companies where they expect to see the integrated solution arrive at their doorstep.
Yeah, and I would say on that front too. I mean, great point. People are looking for the one hand to shake, and it takes a village. We've had a lot of that discussion, but the key. So in COVID, it's pretty easy to find who's needing to respond. You know, the first thing is keep the lights on, get the business going, do curbside checkout, do whatever, contact tracing. You know, in a moment of need, it's very easy. But in the traditional sense of, you know, a solution, it's often very difficult. So yes, you need a package solution. It's like, who do you take it to? Are you selling it to the OT person? Are you selling it to the IT person? Are you selling it to both? Are you selling it to line of business? This is another key challenge. And even in OT, that's something that helps with production could actually hurt safety or quality. You know, so there's competing factions within OT, there's competing factions with IT. So that's one of the challenges, is it's not just about packaging the solution up, it's how do you deliver it and who is that to?
Right.
A few years ago at sort of IoT exhibitions, it was really noticeable to me. You know, if we were on an exhibition stand and everyone was going past, you could really see who was there. And there were a lot of vendors, but there were almost complete lack of systems integrators, and that really worried me. But now I'm starting. I mean, when we're able to have exhibitions again, I started to definitely notice that there are more systems integrators coming into the space, and I think that's because because they're needed and because they can now do something useful, because the other pieces are starting to become mature enough that they can take them and integrate them without having to write massive monolithic sort of applications.
Well, the one thing I would add to that, so totally agree. It's ultimately about domain knowledge, but even on the SI front, there's a spectrum. So on one hand, you've got massive scale of like the disties and the IT GSIs, and people that do like massive scale, and they would love to bill you, you know, $100 an hour plus to rebuild everything. On the other side, you've got like 10 people in 2 trucks in Omaha. They drive trucks out every day and they do things in buildings or otherwise. And then in the middle, you've got kind of like this swath of folks. And so it's like IT scale on one side, OT credibility on the other side. And you got to find this balance between the two for that domain knowledge. And ultimately, I think we're seeing this trend where more and more OT folks are starting to build on consistent IT infrastructure, and that domain knowledge, that system integration, they're like, to your point, I'm going to go build on top of these emerging tool sets, you know, so it's worth it to me. But I think it's just important to kind of delineate between the big GSIs, you know, that are great in their own right, and the people that are like, I do OT, I've been doing it a long time, but I need new tools so I can go help my customers more.
Okay, I'm gonna. Oh,
the only thing I would add is so you already have some SI relationships, it sounds like. The only thing I would add is how can you further vet them? Because if they already have the customers that you're going after, then that's an easier route to market for you versus just using them for the IT side or the OT side, as Jason mentioned. So a lot of the SIs we partner with, they're a little bit more than just the technical piece. So I would encourage you to look for all the elements that you're looking at.
Yeah, they're the channel. They're your channel.
Well, and I agree with that. The thing that we found to be a little bit more difficult going beyond just a contact tracing solution is having the SIs understand the business model opportunity, because they may have customer relationships, but they don't have deep domain knowledge in IoT. They can't translate that IoT capability into a business model. So that's where it gets a little bit difficult to go to market with them, because they do have customer relationships. But when they ask the question, what's in it for me, and what's the value for the customer, because they don't understand that yet.
so this
Still a bit early.
So this ties actually to a question someone asked that we'll introduce you, Jim, eventually. This ties into this question from John Witten, which is, most partnerships require some level of exclusivity, and sometimes they're not reciprocal between all members of an ecosystem. And what are the red flags that you guys see that you're not in a reciprocal relationship, which is kind of related to some of the things that you were just talking about, Thomas. So I don't know if anyone has seen these red flags. I feel like Jason or Irene might be.
I've seen a lot of those red flags over the years. I mean,
what do they look like?
Well, I mean, the first red flag, if you're in a commercial partnership, it's your partner doesn't bring any deals. You're basically bringing all the customer opportunities. You're adding all the value. They're expecting you to make the first move. And, I've had my share of those, and I've had a lot where it's like a very reciprocal relationship where you're kind of riffing off of each other with various different customers. I think that's the big sign. I don't believe that exclusivity is necessarily required. I think that this world is a world of competition. You must be agnostic if you're a software player to hardware and vice versa. But certain levels of exclusivity make sense, including, like, hey, for this market, trying to be exclusive for all markets doesn't make sense. And Ginger, totally right. Like a lot of the SIs have the channel. This is one of the big problems right now is the incumbents have these long-standing relationships with SIs that have the channel, and the startups don't have those relationships, but they got the agility. And it's like, how do you marry all that together is one of the challenges.
And I would just add on to that, a lot of times these days, so I think exclusivity tends to be a bit of a power play. So focusing a little bit less on the red flags, but if you have the flexibility, more and more of the partnerships we do, it's not included. And also, if you are a startup and you are trying to get acquired, it's definitely in your interest to not have that linked to any single company, and you can continue to expand to other markets. So that's what I would encourage. One thing that we put in to help mitigate some of the examples Jason talked about is now in our contracts and working closely with legal and the partner program I talked about that we started in March, we have some metrics that need to be hit in order for you to stay a partner. That way, if it's one-sided or we're not fulfilling what was promised in the beginning, then it's an easier termination on both sides, because obviously the partnership no longer equals the 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah.
Oh, again, haha.
So yeah, I know. So it's like the unwritten rule of what's really bad that we all wish we could change, but nobody's got a good solution, kind of a thing. I will speak about exclusivity in dealing with particularly large incumbent product-based companies who have based their competitive advantage on intellectual property of some kind. Almost always expect exclusivity. And value it much, much higher than they do time to market. We live in a world right now where the churn is so fast, and that time to market can be longer than time in market, depending on the kind of product you have and how fast things are moving. And big incumbent companies, such as my own, really don't value that as much in this world as I think they should. And I'm not speaking out of context, because I've said that in many meetings internally. So, but it remains a challenge. You have something that made you successful over time, and you tend to believe that those success factors continue. We live in a world where the time to market aspect really should trump exclusivity in many ways.
And you win based on merit, not lock-in in the new future. And it's about ecosystems.
Yeah,
Build
exactly.
one, join one.
Yep.
If you don't have an ecosystem, you're dead. Sorry, someone else.
I have a point to make on that, right? So this is from some battle scars from my previous startup. So we have.
Oh wait, Jags.
Yes.
First, introduce yourself, and then go.
Just jump right in. Jags, co-founder and CEO of Latent AI. We bring AI to the edge. We compress any neural network and compile them for any hardware. So now
I'll just add that I met Jag Stacey during your last event and the networking stuff, and we're building some partnership now, so it works.
Yeah. There we go.
All right, so Jags, your point.
Back on the exclusivity, right? So the previous company that I ran, we got into an exclusive agreement with Analog Devices, and I was fighting tooth and nail not to get into an exclusivity, right? So what they did was like, okay, it's not exclusivity. It's just that you cannot work with NXP, you cannot work with Texas Instruments, you cannot work with this, you cannot work with. They put about 10 companies who are critically my next level partners that I could go with, right? But we couldn't. They had invested money and they wiggled around and they got us to sign the agreement. 3 months later, they acquired us, right? They snatched it. But at the same time, it's like, without them, I couldn't have gotten a product out because they were investing money to get a board out for me. Because I was a software company, and without a thing, I couldn't go to the market, right? So this becomes like, how do I decide which way to go, which way not to go, right? So
yeah, I look at it, you know, I don't want to talk too much, but like there's a difference between going full exclusive versus showing a lot of loyalty. So you know, I'm all about choice, but I'll tell you the best choices, and the best choices that I'll tell a customer that doesn't have an opinion are going to be my strategic partners that are loyal to me and likewise. And so that's kind of a form of exclusivity in terms of loyalty.
absolutely.
Oh, okay, let's talk about something. Art. Data, actually, it's not data. It's trust. We'll get to data. So this idea of trust, I know y'all have mentioned it, between your partnerships amongst people in the ecosystem, this kind of ties to the red flags too. How do you foster that? How do you account for it? And then how do you share data in scalable ways that can be trusted? I feel like that's a huge issue for anyone doing this sort of thing right now.
I'll speak to the trust part and leave the data part to the rest of the team. But I think the trust, a lot of where we've had successes being open, direct. It starts with your first workshop. It continues on through your negotiations. If they find out something that you didn't share with them, that's obviously a red flag. So the more open and direct we are with our partnerships, then that tends to foster its own level of trust. And you also have the mobilizer on the other side that's going to work with you if anything ever does happen or something gets misconstrued, and you can always work together to correct it.
I think it's probably about...
And I'll say that fences, I think there's an old saying, fences make the best neighbors. And I think that in these relationships, that's really important, because you need to understand where you're building the relationship and what's out of bounds for that relationship. And in a large company, it's very clear to us what we're doing, and then all the other stuff that we do that has nothing to do with the relationship or partnership. I think in smaller companies, they're not as careful necessarily about relationship starts with and what it doesn't. That creates some trust problems too. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Pilgrim.
No, thank you. I was just going to observe that I think there are at least two kinds of entity that work on data, and it's kind of worth working out which you are and being very clear about that. And it's sort of, I suppose I tend to think of them as services. My current company, Device Pilot, is a service. We take data from customers and we deliver it back to them in a way that helps them run their business. So we're just adding value to their data. It's definitely their data. We won't show it to anyone else. So we just sort of plug into their data ecosystem and add value to it. But there's a completely different kind of business, obviously, which is a platform business or multi-sided business, where it's intrinsically about finding other uses for that data, finding other customers for that data. And those just feel to me like completely different types of thing. And I think, you know, sometimes you get problems where people start off looking like one of those, and then suddenly they morph into another one. And suddenly all the people that produced that data and contributed it suddenly find it being used for other purposes. And I mean, who owns the data is ultimately a bit of a meaningless question, because I'm not sure you even can own data, but it's sort of, you know, who gets to see it under what purpose, under what circumstances and for what reasons. You know, it seems that there are at least those two very different sorts of business.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we did a commission a study with a company called Futurum, an analyst company, last year. It's available online, but very interesting results. We asked companies like N equals 500, what do you think about data monetization? And you know, the result was basically it's all about trust. Of course, people are concerned about regulatory compliance, security. But the order of how do you think you're going to make money on your data was in perfect order of relinquishing trust. So first off, I'm going to make my own products and services better. So it's all my data, and I'm just going to make my stuff better. Second one was, well, I'll give a subscription to my data, but it's still my data. Third one is I'll license it. Next, it was like I'll trade like one for one. Last one was I'm going to put it into a data marketplace. And, you know, like this is where the ultimate scale factor is. You release it, you always own your data, but you set terms based on privacy, IP protection, and value of what you're okay with. And so the next thing, I mean, Stacey knows about this, and I, you know, this notion of trust fabrics and using technology to build trust, because you can't take people out to business centers fast enough one by one to build trust. You must use technology to help. And so I can go on and on about that, but like, you know, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening online, but I think that there's technology that can help, you know, you come to the rescue.
And Jim, I feel like you've been hanging out here. I didn't know if you wanted, very patiently.
I mean, we're going in a lot of different directions in this, you know, this topic. I think it really, you have to kind of narrow it down to what's the segment you're going after, because the approach for corporate partnerships for an enterprise play is very different than for a consumer play. You know, one-on-one exclusivity in a solution for the enterprise is very doable. Companies don't really want to share their data. But when you're talking about, you know, reaching a very low price point for consumer adoption, really you have to be able to figure out a way to open it up and let as many people play as possible without commoditizing all the companies that are trying to contribute, right? I mean, if you've seen success, I've worked on a number of standards and some have been very successful and others haven't, but the ones that have been successful really allow that kind of baseline interoperability and functionality, but still allowed companies large and small to differentiate. And so I think when, you know, you have to look at kind of those pieces when you decide what is your partnership strategy.
Jen's back, and I feel like as a data scientist, Jen, you probably have some really useful things to say here. Sorry, I should remind you what we're talking about, which is data sharing and how to use data, how to share data, maybe any sort of how to know it's trustworthy, etc.
Yeah, it's a super meaty topic. Some of what I see the most of is when there that has a bunch of data that they're maybe not really using effectively, like they have access to it, it's being stored, and then they maybe don't even have the internal expertise. Something like Irene was saying, like an end-to-end usable product, which actually takes that and enables kind of end users to make some decisions in a meaningful way off of kind of insights, workflows, predictions, recommendations, et cetera, derived from the data. And so, especially when you have partnerships between multiple organizations, a lot of the time it's not just who owns the data and then who kind of has rights to use the data in what types of ways, but intellectual property rights come into play a lot here, because often the actual kind of pipelines, transformations, products, user interfaces, et cetera, that are built to turn the raw data into useful data, useful information, that actual entire system has a big intellectual property piece that often whoever kind of builds it has some rights to beyond the person who kind of owns the data themselves. So as you're engaging in these partnerships, I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. And you had mentioned previously, sometimes partnerships come to an end, and then what is the pre-established protocol that all of the associated parties have kind of decided upon when the entire system depends on multiple pieces and each kind of constituent has kind of the rights to a piece, but then the entire system doesn't work without each of the pieces. So that can get really, really interesting and complicated as well.
There's an example related to that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ginger.
Following up on Jen's comment, there's an example of a partnership we're doing right now. The IP, there's some joint development. So we're literally going line by line in an Excel file. So it's super clear. And we also have general counsel that only does IP. So that adds another flavor just to make sure all the expectations are set early on, and then it'll trickle down into all the technical development later.
And I think it's a key piece too. Like we had talked about trying to get an end-to-end version up and running as early as possible that kind of can exercise each of the components, even if they're not in their kind of final vision state. And that also really helps. I think, Jason, you have kind of expecting that you're going to own the entire ecosystem, and that the pieces that you build, you have really clear interfaces for inputs and outputs so that you don't need to actually own end to end, and it can work on its own, even if the inputs and outputs are changing.
Exactly. That's the modularity comment. Building modularity, defining well-established boundary conditions, open APIs, using open source. So you're not doing undifferentiated heavy lifting. All of the above, totally agree. And then you choose where you add value. All we do at Zadita is orchestrating, your choice of applications, clouds, workloads, because I don't want to be in the data path, because the moment I am, I'm competing with domain experts. And so it is about that, it takes village, and the modularity really helps.
And so I was going to build on that and say that I think standards are a really important piece of this. We really haven't talked about them very much here. We've talked a little bit about, Jason, you just mentioned open source, but the whole idea of standards, and this is something I don't see enough small companies participating in standards bodies, because they're exceedingly, what's the word I want? Resource intense in terms of what you have to give. They're very slow to reach agreement on things, and yet they're essential. And I think that smaller companies need to be more actively engaged, as do end users. And end users see this as something that somebody else, some other set of technical experts develops for them. But when you think about interoperability and interchangeability and porting over time to different platforms, standards are an essential
totally agree.
ingredient.
I would say that the new way of driving standards is open source. The old way is like getting in a room and spending months upon months upon months is creating specs. The new way is create open source software that you can kind of rapidly innovate and run on a box and do something with, and then that creates consensus and the snowball effect. So it's not to say standards bodies aren't important, but it's about all the above.
Yeah, I'm laughing, Jason, because I work almost completely in the industrial domain, and we're really slow.
Yeah. No comment.
Okay.
Well, historically, the whole point in industrial has been to create proprietary connectivity to lock people in to my solution. But now the new world, it's about open, because it's you win by merit, not lock in. So anyway, sorry, Stacey, go ahead.
Oh, no, actually on that, I would say that I think there's a role for people like actually Ginger, what you're doing with Honeywell Forge and tying all those 900 integrations together. I'm very curious, do we see that being the long-term play, just to be this person who integrates all of this and then obviously offers other value and domain expertise on top of it? Or do you think actually kind of obviate the need for that chunk of the business or chunk of the expertise?
Mm-hmm. So, Connected, Forge is about a year old. Connected just launched this summer. It is all about open architecture. And I think we started with around 300 connections, and now it's 900. So it's just part of the play to make sure, I guess the whole premise is that you'll be able to do anything within aerospace or buildings or industrials remotely by the palm of your hand. And so in order for that to happen, there's a lot of requirements about what data needs to go into the cloud. So that's conscious going forward.
Got it.
I would say there's varying degrees of openness too. It's important. So there's what I call closed open, which is you can do anything you want with it as long as you pay me a lot of money. And then there's open, which is like truly open APIs. And then there's completely closed, kind of the walled garden. And I think it's important. I think there's always got to be some degree of closed. You want stickiness, but it's figuring out where along that spectrum that you want to run your business along with your ecosystem.
Well, and I would say also having the open, was that what it is? Sort of
closed
open?
Open, close, 220, 221, whatever it takes.
Some of that is also for control of the, I don't think is a crazy thing, right? You can't just have this, especially in an enterprise and industrial. And I bet Ginger is like, yes, that. You don't want to let anybody in, maybe. I don't know. So
this has been all about ecosystems and enterprise ecosystems. The challenge with standards in the IoT space, in my opinion right now, and moving into the future, is that it's going to reapportion where value is harvested in ways we're not really anticipating. Because if I'm an orchestrator, for example, and I take data from anywhere and I give data to anywhere, I'm basically not visible. I'm essential, but I'm not visible. So how do I really harvest value? To who, or from whom do I harvest value? And so some of these standards and the ways that they're moving toward open source, which I think is great, is really going to change the fabric of some of this value creation and harvesting. And some of the traditional players really aren't ready for some of this.
A lot of people are their own worst enemy, to be perfectly honest. And it's the innovator's dilemma. I've got like a gift list of people I'm going to send that book to. It's like, get out of your own headspace and figure out how to change, because the world of open source, yada yada, is coming, and you got to pivot.
All right. Okay, we are at time. If anyone wants to stick around, they can chat. I want to give, a big round of applause to everybody who did this. I don't know if anyone in the comments has other questions. I don't know who's going to hang or what. You're welcome to go to the networking session after this. I also encourage everyone to visit our sponsors at the expo. Jen, for example, is from one of our sponsors, Very. And I'd like to thank also Ayla and Silicon Labs works with. So I don't know, stick around if you'd like, go network if you'd like. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your comments and chats. And all of this will be available. All the replays will be available at stacyoniot.com/connected. So I don't know, carry on.
So, hey, Stacy, this has been one of the best sessions I've done in the last couple of months. So I really appreciate your moderating and pulling it all together, because it's not a trivial thing, but this has been a great session from my perspective.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you want to leave, the leave button is up there in the upper corner.
So we can just hang out till the end of time?
Yeah, you can hang out if you'd like. I mean, I'm just kind of like, we have until noon, but I don't want people to have to sit here forever. And Jason, you and Irene should actually at some point have a chat.
Well, yeah, we need to talk. I've talked with a lot of the Intel folks, but I don't know that we've chatted yet. But
we have not, and I'm probably not necessarily the most the majority voice.
Yeah, she's not the Intel person. And then and Jen is, I will say, all of y'all should talk. I don't know. Everyone I know is wonderful, and I love talking to everybody because y'all are all so smart. So thank y'all very much. And
thanks much, guys. I appreciate it.
Good. We'll see you later.